everybody, and welcome to our November webinar, a collaborative presentation of the Federation for Children with Special Needs and the Recruitment, Training, and Support Center. My name is Janie Kreco, and I am the Training and Support Specialist for RTSC. Today's webinar topic is Protecting Our Children, the Mission and Responsibilities of the Office of the Child Advocate, otherwise known as the OCA. And it's presented by Maria Mossaides.
Yes.
Thank you. Who has held a wide range of positions in the public and independent sectors as an attorney and administrator. Before assuming the position as the child advocate for the Commonwealth, she was the executive director of Cambridge Family and Children's Services. Today, she will speak to the mission and responsibilities of the Office of the Child Advocate. I don't know as I've made the best introduction for you, Maria, because you have a wonderful past, and if you want to just fill it in a little bit, that would be great. We've got a very famous civil liberties advocate here.
Thank you. I went to school in the South Bronx, and I think I was really impacted by what I saw as disparate treatment of young people. In particular, that certain children were abandoned by the adults in the system. And I think that's what caused me to want to go to law school. And I started my career doing civil rights advocacy in the school context. So I worked on school desegregation cases. And also, when I first came back to Massachusetts, ended up being part of what was then a newly emerging disability rights movement. I had a tremendous amount of civil rights experience, knew nothing about disability issues, but was hired because of that background, and ended up working in the sort of mid to late 70s in an era in which Massachusetts state government was preparing itself for the introduction of Chapter 766 and the deinstitutionalization of many of our state facilities. So I worked in a planning unit. I've always considered myself to be a child advocate, even though my career took me off into a different range of state administration, including a stint as the Chief of Staff for the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts. But children's services are always my passion, and so it's truly a pleasure to be back as now the Commonwealth's child advocate for children.
Thank you so much.
So I wanted to thank everyone for the opportunity to come and talk about the role and the function of the Office of the Child Advocate. We are a relatively new state agency, having only been created 9 years ago. I wanted to talk about sort of what child advocacy offices are. In the United States, there are 22 states that have either child advocate or child ombudsman offices. 11 states operate independent child advocacy organizations that focus on children's issues. 3 states have independent offices within their Child Protection Service Agency, and 8 states have non-independent child advocacy centers within the child welfare services. Most states that have child ombudsman or child advocate agencies focus primarily on child protective services, what is the equivalent of our Department of Children and Families. Several states also have jurisdiction that includes the Juvenile Justice Agency. We in Massachusetts are incredibly unique because the Office of the Child Advocate here has very broad jurisdiction, and that we cover all children's services across every state agency that provides children's services to children. Our statute requires us to also focus on what they designate as the most vulnerable children, and that is children in the custody of the Commonwealth, or children who are being served by the Department of Children and Families and the Department of Youth Services. Massachusetts was one of the last of the 22 states to create an Office of the Child Advocate. And what's interesting is next week I will be going to New Hampshire because the New Hampshire Legislature has asked me to testify as they consider establishing what would be the 23rd Office of the Child Advocate should the legislation pass. Want to give you a little bit of history about the Massachusetts Office of the Child Advocate. The recommendation to create the Office of the Child Advocate came out of a legislative report. We are considered to be an independent executive branch agency, and we were established to examine services provided to children, to identify gaps in those services, and to make recommendation to improve the quality of services. The OCA is headed by a child advocate who is appointed by the governor, and going forward, beginning in January of 2019, the child advocate will be appointed by a majority vote of the governor, the attorney general, and the state auditor for a fixed 5-year term. The legislature has, since the office was established, amended our enabling law to increase the independence of the office as it recognized the value of this independent agency. So we were created in March of 2007. The legislature issued a report entitled First Do No Harm. And there was a recommendation to not only create an independent child advocacy office, but there was also debate about the need to create one secretariat and to take all of the child serving agencies and place them within a children's secretariat. As a result of those recommendations, in December of 2007, then Governor Patrick established an Office of the Child Advocate by executive order, and that was quickly followed in July of 2008 by the legislature actually filing a formal enabling bill that legislatively created the Office of the Child Advocate. Our current mission statement is to ensure that all children in the Commonwealth receive appropriate, timely, and quality services with full respect for their human rights. Through collaboration with public and private stakeholders, the OCA examines services to children to identify gaps and trends and make recommendations to improve the quality of those services. The OCA also serves as a resource for families who are receiving or are eligible to receive services from the Commonwealth. As many of you know, we have a very complex service delivery system in Massachusetts. When I started my career 40 years ago, we had half the number of human service agencies that we have today. And children's services in Massachusetts are within 2 secretariats, the Executive Office of Health and Human Service and the Executive Office of Education. Among the 16 human service agencies, only 2 specialize in children, DCF and DYS, and they deal with particularly specialized populations of children. Children's services are a small part and a small focus of the other agencies, such as the Department of Public Health, the Department of Developmental Services, and the Department of Mental Health. And in fact, all of these, it gets even more complicated because the eligibility criteria for services for children are not uniform across all of these agencies and are not uniform when you go from one age to another, or uniformity when you age out of the children's system and go to the adult system. So we have a very complex system that people need to advocate. Our core values are transparency, collaboration, and accountability, which are the core values of Ombudsman's operation. We protect the confidentiality of our complainants, and what we have are agency liaisons with all of the child-serving agencies that enable us to help families and advocates navigate for their clients. I want to talk a little bit about our core functions. So one of our core legislative mandates is to review and investigate complaints regarding services provided by state agencies or state-funded services provided by the Commonwealth's provider community. We also review reports of abuse and neglect in out-of-home settings such as foster homes, group care, early education, and care settings. We review critical incidents of report of all child fatalities in the Commonwealth, near fatalities such as attempted suicides, and serious bodily injury. We also conduct special investigations as necessary. And in fact, the first thing that I did in my job was to do an independent investigation of the death of baby Bella. And on a probably daily basis, I'm over at the Legislature discussing proposed legislation and making recommendations for changes for policies and procedures. We use the information that we gather from the individual case complaints, from the individual review of the critical incident reports, of substantiated abuse and neglect allegations, to really focus on the systemic flaws. What's working, what's not working, what needs to be enhanced. And those hard cases give us an examples of the trends that we need to address in terms of making sure that children get what they need. Let me turn a little and talk about our complaint line. The OCA is mandated to receive complaints about services provided to children in Massachusetts by all state agencies. Parents, grandparents, foster parents, attorneys, social workers, or anyone who needs help finding resources related to the health, safety, and well-being of a child may contact the OCA. And, as I mentioned before, that the OCA maintains the confidentiality of all information that's shared with our office. Many times, individuals call because they want to complain about service, but more often than not, given the complexity of our system, they don't know where to begin to address their concerns. And so many of what we categorize our complaints are really actually requests for information and referral. So let me tell you what we do on the complaint line. We listen to the caller, we guide the caller in navigating state agency systems, and we provide resources to the caller to address their needs. We cannot provide legal advice, provide direct advocacy on behalf of a child, or substitute our judgment for that of a state agency or the juvenile or other courts in the Commonwealth. One of the approaches that we've taken is that if there is an avenue at the individual department where the service issue has arisen, we help to direct the complainant to work within the administrative mechanisms that are available within that system. And only if they can't get relief in those administrative systems that we ask them to call us back. And in fact, we ask everyone who calls us, whether it's for information and referral or whether we've made an intervention, to call us back and provide us with some feedback as to whether that the information that we provided or the assistance that we provided actually helped to resolve their issues. So how do we help? The OCA staff help people to resolve their problems directly with the agency and identify appropriate resources. So a parent calls seeking educational advocacy for the child. Foster parent calls because the foster child has not seen their attorney in a long time. Oftentimes we get called from therapists or other medical personnel concerned about what they believe may be DCF's involvement with a family. Parents and other professionals call to find out about the outcome of a DCF investigation. And oftentimes we get called from kin who are concerned about the timeliness of proceedings in the juvenile court. I want to share with you a slide of the complaints, the data that we have from our complaint line for fiscal year 16, which is the last year of complete data. We are currently working on finalizing the fiscal year 17 data. So we, as you can see, the complaints for the most part pertain to DCF placement issues, as is to be expected. DCF currently serves some 50,000 children, 10,000 that are in the custody of the department, and 40,000 children that they are monitoring at home, and therefore one would expect that the bulk of the concerns are addressed at DCF. We looked at 600 issues in the last fiscal year. And the next slide sort of gives you a flavor of the relationship to the child of the complainant. Again, as can be expected, the bulk of the calls come from biological parents, then grandparents, other relatives, foster parents, and last but not least, we oftentimes get calls from school personnel. As I mentioned earlier, that we also review all of the substantiated investigations of allegations of abuse and neglect that happen in out-of-home settings. And those out-of-home settings include foster homes, all of the Department of Youth Services programs, residential treatment programs, that include Chapter 766 residential and day schools, licensed preschool and child care, and all public elementary and secondary schools. Our focus is always on children who are not being served at home, because we believe that parents are placing a extra set of eyes on their child. So when we need to prioritize what we do, we focus on children who are not living with their family and therefore do not have those family set of eyes on the child. As you can see from the next slide, that we had 328 reports of substantiated abuse and neglect in out-of-home settings. And you can see there's residential, there's foster care, and this is the array of the percentage of cases that we review. The following slide also talks about the type of abuse that we expect. Nationally, neglect is the sort of represents 85% of all allegations and substantiated cases of abuse and neglect, with physical abuse and sexual abuse representing probably the remaining 15%. And as you can see, neglect also for Massachusetts represents the highest number of reports, followed by physical abuse and sexual abuse, and a very small number of abuse and neglect. So that our numbers, in many respects, mirror the national numbers of abuse and neglect. We also look at critical incident reports. These are reports that are required to be filed by people who are providing licensed care to children in the Commonwealth. We look at all child deaths, all near fatalities, and all instances of serious bodily injury. And we receive critical incident reports from mostly the agencies under the Executive Office of Health and Human Services, that is the Department of Developmental Services, the Department of Children and Family, Mental Health, Public Health, and Youth Services. And these come into our office on a daily basis, and we then examine the circumstances in which the child was injured, or unfortunately the child has died, with the idea of examining the clinical practice. And if we believe that there were errors in the clinical decision making, we have follow-up discussions with the agencies. And we also look to see whether there are trends. Does this indicate that a program design might not be serving the population of children that it was designed to serve? Again, the following slide gives you a sense about how those critical incidents are distributed across the agencies. Many of the reports that come from the Department of Public Health and the Department of Developmental Services unfortunately represent the deaths of children who were born medically fragile. And so these are deaths that are very sad and tragic, but they were deaths that for the most part were anticipated given the medical complexities with which these children were born. So that those numbers on the surface appear high, but are not necessarily high. The Department of Youth Services, many of the injuries and deaths occur after children receive services from the department and are returned in the community, oftentimes many of these young adults had prior involvement with gangs, and when they are returned to the community, there is continued gang violence, and people attempt to sort of injure them, which unfortunately oftentimes results in the death or serious injury of a child. We have many priorities and projects that are going on. The OCA participates in a child fatality review program that occurs at a statewide and at local levels directed by the district attorney's offices. We are currently doing the first review of how that process is going. A first review in the 16 years since the child fatality review process was established in Massachusetts. The Office of the Child Advocate also co-chairs the Child Sexual Abuse Prevention Task Force, which is a legislative task force that has mandated that we come up with a framework for preventing child sexual abuse. We issued a major report to the legislature outlining 6 major tasks that need to be done, and we are now embarking on a local listening tour, working in local communities to design technical assistance and training programs with the goal of reaching every child-serving organization and business, such as local dance studios and karate studios, so that we can train people on how to prevent child sexual abuse. We are working currently on 2 major pieces of legislation. The first is to raise the age of child marriage from 0, which is where the law currently has it, to 18. We have about 40 child marriages a year, and we recognize that child marriage is very destructive because oftentimes the child bride fails to complete her education, and anyone who is married before the age of 18 loses certain protections, including the protection of a 51A or child abuse and neglect petition being filed for them. They cannot go into court because they're underage and ask for a 209A domestic violence protection order. So we are trying to sort of encourage the legislature to basically no longer permit parents asking the court and granting permission for child marriages. We are also advocating for legislation to criminalize the practice of female genital mutilation, which unfortunately still occurs in certain communities, and we are working with those communities and hope that as part of the current criminal reform bill that is in the legislature, both in the House and the Senate, that they will also clarify that female genital mutilation is in fact an attack and abuse on women, and we will be able to protect young women. And last but not least, we are in the second phase of a major review of making improvements to the monitoring and licensing and response processes for residential schools, which are the places where many of the children in the Commonwealth with extreme behavioral challenges are served. So, I wanted to share with you our website. We truly believe that no single agency or system can provide all of the resources that are needed to support and strengthen families within the Commonwealth. And we believe that collaboration is critical at every single level. We need your help because all of you are the people who are actually on the front lines, and that we try to get as much information from advocacy organizations as we can so that we can identify trends and patterns and are able to take corrective action. So I thank you very much for this opportunity to share information, and we hope that you will utilize our complaint line and our resources and reach out to us, and that we will be able to assist you in your efforts of helping children. Thank you.
A couple of slides kind of jumped out at me. the greatest part of our audience for these webinars are special education surrogate parents, and their students are in residential facilities or congregate care facilities. And I noticed that the reports of abuse and neglect in the out-of-home settings are the greatest in residential facilities. What do you see as trends, and what kind of cases come to your attention from those places?
Yeah, I think what tends to sort of come are sort of issues regarding runaways, that for many of these programs they're not locked facilities, they may be staff secure facilities, and that if we don't have the perfect placement, that oftentimes children run, or children run because they want to be home with their families and they don't want to be in an institutional setting. I think the other challenges that we see in those settings are that these are children and young adults who oftentimes have very extreme behavioral challenges, and that there are instances where staff at these facilities are not on top of how to respond to those behavioral issues. In any given year, we have probably a limited number of circumstances where staff just kind of lose their cool and lay hands on a child inappropriately. And those are clearly instances in which we expect that the staff person will be terminated immediately, and we confirm that that happens. But I think that what we're seeing is that there has been a tremendous turnover in staff. We are experiencing, as the economy gets better and more opportunities arise, that many of the young professionals who work in these programs seek other jobs. It's hard work, it's demanding work, and what I think across the board we can say is that we're seeing staff that are not staying for long periods of time, and therefore getting the kind of personal experience and tools around interventions, and that is causing oftentimes incidents to occur, not necessarily resulting in injuries to the students, but clearly there is a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of ensuring that staff at these facilities have the proper training and the proper coaching and support as they launch their careers in human services.
Thank you. That was very diplomatic. And what comes to mind is the model of residential facilities. I think needs to be reviewed carefully, probably not by your office, but what I have read in my research is the idea of group homes that are more specific for specific populations and have more consistent parental type caregiving. Right. And I'm not sure how fast that's going to happen, but I would like it to happen a lot faster than it is.
I certainly think that several years ago the Commonwealth rethought residential services under the branding of Caring Together Initiative. And that some of that, I think, in conjunction with the implementation of our new restraint and seclusion policies, have resulted in a lot of positive things. Yes. There is an increased emphasis in some of these programs on funding for more appropriate medical intervention. So there's been a revamping of our medical administration protocols, which I think were long overdue. I know that we are currently looking at some of those program models with the idea that, as you said, that we may need to develop more highly specialized models for particular populations, and that may need to result in additional staffing requirements and staff youth ratios, and I know that some of that is currently going on.
And a couple other questions. So could you explain the difference between your office and the Office of the Ombudsman?
Yeah, well, many states have they do a more formal process. So, for example, in the far west, Washington and Oregon, their ombudsman office actually does, by law, clinical reviews of cases. And those cases are actually published rather than maintaining the confidentiality. And there is a requirement for the state agency to do a formal response back in terms of whether they agree with the ombudsman clinical assessment or not. There are oftentimes allegations of unfairness on the part of the staff of the department, and ombudsman's offices will go in and do an actual personnel investigation and do more of what we would consider to be a kind of civil rights investigation in terms of whether there was discrimination on the part of the staff. That's not the model that was adopted in Massachusetts, and actually all 22 states have models that really reflect the personality and culture and the sort of organizational structure of their state. But as I said, for most of the 22, the focus is entirely only on their state DCF, really looking at the children who were removed from their family's care and taking a hard look as to whether that removal was necessary, even though all removals in every state are supervised by a judge. Nonetheless, I think that there's always concern that the state agency is not assessing circumstances where children might be able to be left at home with sufficient safety precautions, and always the concern around taking children into custody rather than leaving them at home. And that, I think, is really the difficult judgment call that DCF is called upon every single day to make in lots of cases, and it's a hard decision to make.
And my last question, I noticed in one of the slides that you were investigating, here it is, the number of critical incidents with CBHI. And that was my question when you first started going, is what is your relationship with the Medicaid or CBHI?
Yes, so CBHI is kind of interesting because they are really a funding source.
Yeah.
I mean, they're kind of Mass Health is kind of an insurance program, and
Right.
it's not as a traditional state agency. So the way in which we traditionally get those complaints are coming from family members who believe that they were eligible for CBHI
okay.
services and weren't receiving them, or people who were unhappy by the quality, usually the quality and timeliness of services in CBHI.
Okay.
So if you're a family who child is eligible for both the children's services and the family support for the families, and it's not working, we will take those complaints again, and then work both with the providers who have been hired to provide those services, but also we spend some time, we have relationships also with the CBHI folks, and so there are times when we can reach out directly to them for an appropriate intervention.
So do you do any oversight of systemic things in CBHI? They seem to,
Yes.
That's a problem, I think.
Well, so CBHI is one of those interesting things because currently there is a formal court monitor
Yes.
who is supposed
Yes.
to, and who I know,
Yeah.
performs that oversight function. There is currently a piece of legislation before the Massachusetts Legislature that wants the Office of the Child Advocate to assume that function when the court decides to release the Commonwealth from the obligation of having a court-imposed monitor. And so I think the advocacy community is already thinking a step ahead that at some point the judge will release the Commonwealth of that obligation of the court oversight. And when that happens, there is concern that we need to do some special oversight. The Office of the Child Advocate has testified that we are absolutely in support of that legislation. So we may be assuming some of the current court monitor's function when that day comes and the sort of court monitor is no longer in place.
How many people are on your staff?
We have a really tiny staff.
gonna say,
We have a staff of 5.5 full-time equivalents. Our model is a model that I've done a lot of thinking about, which is that we want to have a small group of very capable staff who are experts in many things, but also generalists. Because in any given year, the issues that we may be exploring might require a level of expertise that we couldn't keep all of those experts on. And so what we do is rely on a series of consultants that we've been working with, and as we need expertise, we, fortunately, the legislature has been very generous, so we can go out and hire the expertise to come and work on a particular project until the issue is resolved. The model that we're using is one of collaboration and really serving as a neutral facilitator. So we pull together all of the affected state agencies with input from the providers and advocates, and we try to examine reach a consensus on what the problem may be or the challenges are, agree to a solution, and then launch the solution and ask the agencies to own that solution. So we'd like to sort of start, convene people, figure out what needs to be done, arrange for that to start happening, and for us to then take our more oversight function and to allow the agencies that own the issue to actually be responsible for the continued implementation of the solution.
So you're the catalyst for change, but you carry a big stick.
We certainly carry the stick of being able to have that sort of public, the Billy pulpit.
Yeah.
And I think that's one that we are careful because I think that we truly believe that it's very rare to find someone both on the state side and the provider community that you don't go into this business to make $1 million, because that's not going to happen. You go into this business because you have a passion for children. Mm-hmm. And so we believe that everyone starts and really tries to do the best that they can do, but that oftentimes that best sometimes is not enough. So we're all about collaboration and working together and bringing to bear all of the resources that we have in an effort of protecting children and really giving every child in Massachusetts the opportunity to thrive and to be prepared to enter into a well-functioning adulthood.
Well, thank you so much, Maria. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, and we will see you again, audience, in December.
Thank you.